But thank you for coming. I assume I would just thank you because there were nice things said. And I assume you've all been staring at this slide on the screen. So let me, this is going to be a kind of freewheeling discussion about staring. I'm not a staring expert. Rosemary Thompson is the staring expert, but I'm willing to give this a shot. So I wanted to begin with this picture, which is of my family. I am the small one in the picture. And that's my father, Morris Davis, my mother, Eva Weintraub, who was, her mother was and father were from Poland, and the name was Chmielewski, my brother and myself. And my parents were both deaf, and they, and so I want to begin with my recollection of a specific repeated event, which was that my parents often would be on, I grew up in the Bronx in New York City, and my parents often would be on the subway. And they would go to their deaf club, which was in Manhattan, at least once a week, and they would be on the subway talking in sign language, very excitedly, or as the case may be. And everybody on the subway car was staring at them. And if I was with them and I was a small child, I determined that it was my job to, if the subway car was filled with people, I would start with the person all the way on the far left and stare at them until they looked away. Then I would go to the next person, the next person, the next person, the entire subway car. And by the time I had gotten to the end, I'd have to go back because the first person was staring again. It's a little bit of obsessive staring on my part, but it was my way of defending my parents against the stare and maybe dealing with the issue of shame that staring can produce a feeling of shame. But also I responded with a kind of anger and a desire to counteract the stare with another stare. And I think that is part of the nature of staring, is that, as Rosemary Thompson says, it is a starer and a staree. And the starer is the one who's staring, and the staree is the recipient of the stare. But I also think that those roles can be reversed, and I'll talk about some of the dynamics of that in this talk. So Rosemary Thompson's book, which if you're interested in staring, you should read, is called Staring How We Look. And it's going to be in Polish. It's going to be translated into, by Theater 21. I understand next year it's coming out. And my book, Enforcing Normalcy, which also is being translated into Polish. So we are nice bookends, literally, with each other. In that book in 1995, I defined disability as a disruption in the visual field. And in 2009, Rosemary Garland Thompson defined staring as a disturbance in the visual status quo. And for me, it was important to define disability that way because what I wanted to avoid was a materialist, essentialist description of disability. Because disability, I think, before then was generally seen as a physical problem or a problem in audition or whatever. But I wanted to make it more interesting and complicated by putting the onus of disability more on the person who was looking rather than the person who was being looked at. And I think for Rosemary Thompson, a similar kind of way of thinking about disability as a disturbance in the visual status quo. You see something and something's different and you react to it. This is a definition of civil inattention. So most of the time, if you live in an urban area, you have grown up to not look, to not stare. So this is the thing, a norm of mass market society, which requires that one carefully avoid interaction with others' physical present. If the others are part of a social base, then civility would be required. If others are non-persons, then one can be uncivilly inattentive, i.e. one can stare, push, look through, speak, through or talk about others in that presence. So I mean, what essentially is being said is that our normal approach in in an urban area is to not pay attention to the people who are walking by. And we all know that there's a kind of convention, which is that when you're walking on the street, you can look at the person. I mean, this has been studied by sociologists, right? You can look at the person up to about 15 feet away from you, like 5 meters away from you, and then you have to look away until the very last second when they pass, and then you can have a quick exchange of glances. Sort of a convention. I don't know, is that true in Poland? Because it kind of that's the way it works in the US. Different countries have different, I think France, there's more staring for some reason. It's interesting because Walker Evans, who's an American photographer, when he went to France, he was surprised that you were allowed to stare. And then you can go through the sociology of different countries, but the point is that we generally don't stare at each other unless somebody is considered, according to this definition, a non-person. If you're a non-person, then you can be stared at. And obviously, poor people, people with disabilities, people with some kind of lower social status, perceived lower social status, will be stared at. And that's part of, I think, when I was staring at the people on the subway to not look at my parents, I was saying, like, don't consider them lesser than you. So this is a little bit, people become transfixed due to the work of the amygdala. So this is more of a brain explanation. The amygdala is part of your brain. So people become transfixed due to the work of the amygdala. A primitive part of the brain evolved to sort faces into safe and potentially unsafe categories. When the amygdala cannot process a face that doesn't fit any it has previously encountered, it simply freezes, like a computer unable to process a command. Scientists say that regaining composure requires serious conscious effort. So in other words, if you think about the situation of seeing something that kind of, the British call it being gobsmacked, like literally your gob, I guess that's your mouth, is smacked. We have lots of expressions to jaw-dropping in English, where something happens and you have to stare. This is also true for animals. This is a video of a cat watching Psycho. I don't know if you've seen this. My son sent it to me a few days ago, so I decided to put it. But it's kind of worth. Let's see if I can get this to work. I paid the cat to do that. The thing is, though, that every part of that cat's reaction is exactly the same as ours. I mean, so the point is that staring is a normal part of life. It's not an abnormal. And so there's always a negotiation between the normal response or a typical response and how we manage that in various situations. Whoops, sorry. So the other thing I wanted to kind of introduce is that staring isn't all bad. Clearly, a lot of science, experimentation has to do with staring. If you think about Galileo with his telescope, discovering something by looking carefully at a situation that no one had really recorded before, and then, needing to say it, and of course, being exiled for it. Just another example of science requiring a very careful looking at things. There was, of course, we know the famous observers of the early atomic bomb testing who were staring at something which then actually turned out to be disabling for many of them, being exposed to radiation. Also, they were part of a scientific experiment themselves. Even though they were staring, they were being stared at, being photographed, being recorded. They're bird watchers. I don't know any of you are bird watchers, but it does require a careful kind of attention. If you've ever gone on a safari, which I have not, that requires another kind of attention. I don't know if you saw this movie, but the premise of it is that the U.S., I mean, it's based on this fact that the United States Army Special Ops, Marines, I guess, were training in the 1960s and 70s to be able to kill people by staring at them. This is for real, actually. And so these people practiced by staring at goats, and one person apparently succeeded, at least, if not killing, at least making a goat fall down. So there is a power in a stare. I mean, a stare is not a neutral thing. The only two groups of people who can legitimately and sustainedly stare in each other's eyes are mothers with nursing babies and lovers. I mean, otherwise, if you can't do that. You know, it's generally considered a hostile act to stare for a long period of time. The other thing, there's all of this kind of sociological studies about the role, like when you're in conversation with somebody, there is a delicate balance, and people with autism or on the spectrum experience this very acutely. There's a very delicate balance between looking at someone and having a conversation, making eye contact, not making eye contact. So, and there are kind of social rules about this. I've given my students tasks, which I could give you. Generally, in the conversation, when someone is looking away, that is a move to be superior to the other person. So generally, like, I would instruct my students to go talk to a dean or an administrator or a head of a corporation, Trump, and tell them to have a conversation but look away. Be the one who's looking away. It's very hard to do that because there is a kind of incredible dance, a balletic dance of the eyes that has to do with making contact but not too long, who looks away, who looks in each other's eyes. This is another study. When a face is distorted, we have no pattern to match that. All primates show this staring at something very different, something they have not evolved to see. They need to investigate further. Are they one of us or not? In other species, when animals look very different, they get rejected. So this leads into the sort of disability issue. I don't know if you've ever read this book by Lucy Greeley called Autobiography of a Face, but you can see she had lots of facial surgery. This is kind of a, posed portrait. And Greeley says, wherever I went, even just to the store with my mother, I was never overlooked. I could count on some sort of attention. And I discovered that people were embarrassed when I caught them looking. I stared right back at the strangers, and they always looked away quickly, trying to pretend they hadn't been staring. I mean, she was using we had the same strategy for dealing with people who stared. This is a photograph that's of a blind woman. And so one of the issues also is, if someone can't see you, then does that give you license to look? And to what extent, what's your visual interaction with people who are blind? I mean, blind people talk about this all the time because most blind people can see to some degree. I mean, there's almost no blind person who absolutely can't see. So then the interactions between people who are sighted and people who are blind are complicated by that. Also, in the United States, you may have heard of this, there were these ugly laws, the laws that were passed in many cities, that basically said that if you had in the list of facial disfigurements and other things that people might find upsetting, people were not allowed to be on the street, and they could be fined for being on the street, which is an interesting thing, because rather than putting the blame on the starer, the blame is being put on the staree. Like if people are staring at you, and you have some reason that they're staring at you, then you are actually legally culpable. Some of these ugly laws were not gotten rid of until like 40, 50 years ago. I mean, they were, on the books anyway, if not enforced. It was the idea of being a public nuisance visually. Sorry. Yeah, so then there's also, this has to do with expectations, and we were discussing this last night. That got me to put this in. In the United States, there is a contest called Miss Wheelchair America. It's a beauty pageant. And in one year, there was a woman who won, and then this photograph of her on the left, she's a teacher, showing her standing up, the people were outraged, and her beauty crown was taken away. But she said that she had a form of muscular dystrophy that was progressive, and that she needed to use a wheelchair. But the distraction for people of categories about disability, either, for most people, you're disabled or you're not. And it's kind of like, you can't be like a little pregnant, So it's that kind of concept that it's a black and white concept of being disabled or not. And if you somehow like are transgressing that binary opposition, then somehow you're responsible. And this woman had to give up her crown because people were upset that she was able to stand occasionally. So there is within the disability community, there are kind of more or less complicated responses. One of these is the more kind of aggressive response in these two badges or memes that people have. What are you staring at, you two-legged freak? Staring? Keep staring, I might do a trick. So there is a kind of strategies that have to do with humor and also a kind of sarcastic playfulness in dealing with the issue. The other thing we didn't talk about so much is that there is the stare that produces a kind of either a shameful response or an aggressive or a more like feisty response. But then there's also the stare that's aggressive. And this again, I don't know, it's a Hitchcock kind of event here. But this is you may remember there's a famous scene from Strangers on a Train that points this out dramatically. Yeah, so, that sustained stare, given the way Hitchcock brilliantly has the tennis game going, but that sustained stare of the man who he met on the train, who's now a threat to him, is very powerful there. Also, at least everybody's familiar with this, stares that are sexually abusive or aggressive, and they're, this is a really complicated story because you can go back to Castiglione and Renaissance writers where you'll have a description of like the love at first sight, and that it has to, in the Renaissance they believed they were eye beams. That there's two theories of seeing. One is that, if you never knew anything about seeing and you didn't know about the retina and the lens and all of that, if you just imagine yourself before that time, it's been kind of complicated to think about how you saw. What was the process by which you would see? And the Renaissance and the Greeks, some of the Greeks too, thought that you had eye beams that went out and hit objects. So like vision was coming from you, not from the object to you. And there's lots of descriptions about how like your I-beams go, you know, in a sexual kind of erotic sense, go to the beloved, who then literally receives the I-beams and gets stimulated and then sends I-beams back to you. And then it's Romeo and Juliet, you know, you're in love at first sight. But now in our era of #MeToo, we understand better that these kind of these things can be very aggressive and very abusive. The other kind of vision is tied up with, you know, the freak show and putting people on display to be stared at. I don't know, you know, I don't think there are freak shows anymore. Has anyone here ever been to a freak show? You have to be of a certain age. But I remember distinctly as a child going to Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus in New York City, and there was a freak show, sideshow, and there were all of these people who were with disabilities who were being shown, and I was there with my mother who was deaf, and I couldn't quite understand the process because should my mother be up there, you know, along with these freaks? But it was a very much an important part of at least American culture for a long time, which gave people the right, you paid for the right to stare at people with disabilities. And then you may know about Sart J. Bartman. She was called the Hottentot Venus. This is an example of, you know, about 25 isms, racism, sexism, whatever, colonialism. She was from South Africa, and she, in the 19th century, she was brought to England and Europe to be put on display because of her buttocks. She was kind of considered an example of a missing link between humans and animals. If you don't know about her, it's really worth reading about her. It's dramatic, horrible, but she never went back to South Africa, and she spent all of her life, the rest of her life, and she died in Europe. Her body was dissected, again, trying to take this medical gaze and stare at it in a way that they couldn't do in life. And but what's interesting was, and this is the kind of like paradox, women at that era were wearing bustles to have the exact same look that Sart J. Bartman had naturally. So one was considered socially acceptable, and the other was considered abnormal. And that other also tells us just about the social constructed nature of the way that we stare and what we consider normal and not normal. This is actual death mask and body cast of Sart J. Bartman that's in France. When she died, I mean, the level of staring at her, the invasiveness of it was considered just part A of a scientific gaze, part of a cultural gaze. We don't quite have the parallel to that. This is, if anyone has ever been to La Specola in Florence, this is a museum where anatomical wax figures were made for medical purposes. And this is one in particular. You can see that it has parts, you can take her apart. So literally, this is a kind of a medicalized gaze, but what's interesting is they tried to make the figures very artistic and attractive. They're kind of like Madonnas. And you have the kind of contrast between being able to stare at the naked body, and then not only at the naked body, but inside the naked body, which is the beginning of a whole kind of notion of the medical gaze. This is from the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which has a huge collection of people and fetuses with disabilities who are preserved. I've never been there. I've been afraid to go. I know a lot of people with disabilities have gone and written about it and sort of said I should, in another world, I would be there. But it also raises the question of staring at the dead and whether that is acceptable or not, and also preserving people who have physical differences and then using them as subjects for staring. Okay, I'll stop. That's all the icky stuff. Now I'm looking at a little bit of art. Actually, this is in the wrong place, but I might as well talk about it anyway. This was a painter called Margaret Keane. She painted in the 1960s, and these paintings were considered like kitschy, but they're filled with mostly children staring with these gigantic eyes. And I think it's interesting that it kind of coincides with a period in American life where there was a lot of surveillance going on, and fears of Soviet surveillance in America, that these large-eyed creatures are there. So I want to talk about Michel Foucault. I'm sure many of you know who he is, but for those of you who don't, he's a philosopher in the 20th century who probably is one of the major philosophers. And what I'm particularly interested in was, he has a book called Surveiller et Punir, translated into English as Discipline and Punish. He was interested in the way that science and intellectual life controlled our behavior by using power as a form of observation and surveillance. That's like so unfair to Foucault, but since we're moving along quickly, I'll say that. He, in this book, Discipline and Punish, he described this building that was designed by Jeremy Bentham called the Panopticon. And it was the first kind of modern prison. And the whole concept, as you can see in the picture, is that the cells are in a circle around a central tower. And so every prisoner is completely visible to the guards in the center tower, who can observe them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And for Bentham, this observation was going to be a form of punishment that would make them repent and reform. So you can see the power of the stare there and surveillance in general. Foucault also talks about the way that observation, discourse, what he calls discourse, works in terms of mental disabilities. And so there was a lot, in the 19th century, there were a lot of people who photographed people with mental illnesses. I don't like to use the term mental illness, but mental disabilities, emotional, affective disorders, to see, and painted as well. Géricault painted a lot of people, to see whether you could see physically what was going on inside the head. And obviously also physiognomy, the study of the lumps in your brain and the shape of your head, was an attempt to see inside by, essentially staring at people. And Charcot, this is a kind of famous painting of Charcot. He took lots of photographs of people who had hysteria, mostly women. And I could spend an hour talking about this photograph. But he had a specific woman who he would bring before an audience like this in a medical setting, and she would have a hysterical fit, and he would describe it and document it, and everybody would stare at it and look at it. And it's the origins of modern medicine, is what Foucault basically says. Here's some photographs from Charcot. And of course, we have our friend Sigmund Freud, who, if you want to talk about obsessive looking at something, I mean, psychoanalysis and Freud's case histories look at people in a kind of detail that no one had done before him, And so to take somebody who Freud saw as not normal or abnormal, and to write everything they said and to study everything they said as if they were a kind of vastly complicated text, was really the nature of the Freudian intervention. So if you've ever read Freud's Rat Man, Notes on a Case of Obsessional Neurosis, one of the things, it's one of the foundational texts of psychoanalysis, and it's about obsession, but it is the most obsessive text itself. Every little detail of this man's life and thought is being studied word by word, phrase by phrase. So we don't think about it, but obsessive staring is part of what makes science, medicine. So then we have photography, and Walker Evans, I mentioned before, took a series of photographs of people who are poor and during the Depression. So, but his phrase, "I stare and stare at people shamelessly," means that if you think about photography and you think about documentary photography, we get into a problem about the nature of staring. And I want to talk about that a little bit around this picture. So you may know this picture. It's called Migrant Mother. It's by the American photographer Dorothea Lange. She took the picture in 1936. And I don't know if you know this picture, but it's got an iconic status in the United States. There's a postage stamp that was made of it. It's been reproduced a million times. How many people are familiar with this picture? Okay. And you know, it's supposed to be a picture that kind of depicts, I don't know, what do you see in it? Like white American woman's determination while being poor to carry on. None of that's true, by the way, and I want to get into that a little bit. But this is what Dorothea Lange said about this picture. So she was driving by. She saw a sign that said pea picker settlement. These are people who picked peas. She said, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember that she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her and seemed to know that my picture might help her, and so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it. I mean, I can give you now like a 2-hour lecture on this picture alone, and in that phrase, there was a sort of equality about it, because there was no equality about it. You know, you have a woman who's like from the middle class with a big camera in those days coming and approaching this woman. But what's interesting about the photograph is that the 2 kids, there's actually a baby on her lap also, you can't see it, that she's been nursing. But the 2 kids' faces are turned away. I mean, they're aware of the stare and the power of the stare and the issues around their shame and their poverty. And the mother, for whatever reason, is looking out. But I think that if you think about these kind of photographs of poor people taken by people who weren't poor, you get into not only the stare, but the power of the stare, the institutional power. Now I want to show you a few other things. So that's the photograph. Well, I'm sorry, going backwards. So this was the thing that's said on the photograph. Destitute pea pickers. All of this is wrong, by the way. All that information that Lange gives is incorrect. And these people were not pea pickers. But here's the first photograph she took. We happen to have discovered these photographs. And you can see the first one, the mother is in the background. Actually, there's a teenage girl who's not in the later picture. And you get the sense of the actual distance. The stare really doesn't have that quality. But the teenage girl who's sitting there, everybody's looking at the photographer. They're staring at her. Remember, in the official picture, no one's staring at the photographer. So there's no reciprocity. But here, she's staring at her. Second picture, a little closer, and you can see the teenage girl's moved inside the tent, and she's looking away. She doesn't want to have anything to do with this now. While the other 2 kids, the kid is still looking. A little closer now, teenage girl's out of the picture. One of the girls is gone. Little detail, we can see that she's wearing a wedding ring, which doesn't really show up later on. This is the one that shows that she's not alone. She actually has a life. She's married. Here's another picture a little closer, and then breastfeeding. All of this has taken quite a while. So Dorothea Lange's description of like, I just was drawn in, this has to take a while to happen. These pictures are not, in other words, they're not random shots, they're posed. She's told people, move here, go there, do this, which has another power on top of the staring. And this is the final picture that she took. And by the way, just a little detail that's interesting is if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can see her thumb over there. That was taken out of the picture. So even with all the posing and everything, it's just, there's still a little photoshopping going on. So how documentary this is, you know, you have to wonder how much the stare is really constructing the image that it wants to see. And I have one other just tiny detail that totally transforms the picture, which is that this woman actually has a name. Her name is Florence Owens Thompson. We didn't know her name until about 20 or 30 years later, when she wrote a letter to a camera magazine and said, please stop using this picture. I never wanted it to be used. And her children said that they were embarrassed by it. So it's an iconic photograph where this, not only the stare, but the impulse to do it is completely contrary to what she wants. The second thing is she's a Cherokee. She's a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. She's not a white woman. So that, that accounts for, if that had been the case and if that had been known, this picture would have never been famous. So just another detail about this. The stare thinks it knows what it's doing, but can get things totally wrong because of the power dynamic. So then we have Diane Arbus. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her. Took lots of pictures of people with disabilities. They're meant to be, I mean, again, is this a picture that's coming from the subjects, or are the subjects being stared at and fixed in a way to make them an object of weirdness? Because Diane Arbus was a photography of weirdness. I mean, the people are smiling, but the photograph doesn't make us feel like we're supposed to smile with them. Another picture by Diane Arbus. She sought out people with disabilities, but she never acknowledged them as people with disabilities. She put them in the category of weird or strange. By the way, there's I don't know if you ever saw that movie, what's it called? It's sort of, it's about making a movie. I forget the name of it. It's a kind of funny film. Anyway, forget that part. But when like a filmmaker wants to include the weird, often in the past, like even like someone like David Lynch, they would introduce a person of small stature to give a surreal feeling to the film. So obviously not from the point of view of the person with disabilities, but because of the stereotypical effect that something like that is going to produce. Okay, so then I just have some works of art that involve staring. I don't know if you remember these from when you were a kid, but these are the kind of pictures that you have to like stare at them in a kind of unfocused way, and then you can see a three-dimensional object within. Do you remember those? Yeah, so I mean that actually was an interesting form of staring that had a productive effect. I remember my kids would be staring at these things for hours, and then they would show it to me, and I couldn't get to see the thing that they were looking at. I had to, you have to really kind of spend a lot of time with this kind of unfocused stare. This is a Magritte painting, but raising the issue about paintings are things that we are supposed to stare at. Actually, most people don't stare at paintings. I've done my own informal study. I advise you to do this. Go to a museum, stand by a painting, and see how long the average person looks at the painting. Anybody want to guess a number? Because I've counted this many, many times. 30 seconds. Too much. Too much. 5 seconds. It's like about 7. The average person looks at a painting for about 7 seconds. So there is a kind of like, and I think people are going like, okay, sky, cow, water, good, got it. So there is, on the one hand, we don't stare enough. You have to be taught to how to look at paintings so that you will actually look at it for a long time. On the other hand, staring is, as I'm trying to say, is a very complex thing. Pop art requires us to have optical illusions. In order to do that, you have to stare at a painting for a while. And something like the water lilies, I mean, people go into the room and they sit down. That's when they just want to be in the room with the water lilies. I don't know how much they're actually looking at the paintings, but there's this kind of sense like, I'm in the room with the water lilies. It's beautiful. Let's act as if we're sitting in nature. So that's another kind of being with. So then the answer to a question is like, what do you do about staring? And I think, you all know, particularly what you do, which is that you make it into art. You could take control of the situation, and something like Theater 21 has done that. You know, the people who are acting in the plays, they have taken control of the staring. They're directing it. They know what they want to get from the audience. So we have Diana, who knows what to do. I mean, she is able to control by dance, staring. And then we have the people sitting in the parliament here in Poland who know what to do. In other words, you can go for art, you can go for politics, and you can make that happen. You can go in art, you can go for politics. There isn't an exclusion to that. In the US, there is a big disability movement around transportation and the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so again, use the staring, control it, focus it for the things that need to be done. There's a painter in the United States, you may have, I don't know if you've heard of her or not, called Riva Lera. She is disabled, and she has done an incredible body of work about disabled people. And, okay. That's like an auditory staring. What do we call that? Is there a word for that? Like we just listening, but is there something more intense? Listening hard. What? No, I guess we don't have it. Staring is a more powerful thing. So Riva has done this painting. She has this many paintings. I really recommend you go to her website, rivalera.com. And here's a painting that she did of Alice Shepard, who is a dancer and a wheelchair user. These are part of a painting called the Risk series, and the reason I mention it is because what she did was not simply stare at, because if you're a portrait painter, you have to stare, but to ask the subject of the painting to then, she had this thing, she would paint the figure, leave the room for hours, and ask the person who was being painted to draw on the canvas. And so all of the stuff you see around the figure was drawn by Alice Shepard. And then she did this with another person, which is why I know about this. And in this one, she did my figure, and then she left. And I said to her, look, I really, you know, she said, just do what you want to the painting. And I said, I don't want to mess this painting up. I mean, this is a really good painting. You want me to mess it up? And she said, you know, you have to do something. So I don't know if you can see it, but I did a lot of writing that have to do with putting me between, my parents were deaf, so putting me between deafness and hearing. But that interaction does change the nature of being stared at. And, you know, having sat for this picture for hours, I mean, I would say like 10 hours went into my sitting, you realize when you go see a painting like, you know, all the portraits in the Prado or whatever museums, you realize they're silent. Those portraits are silent, but you realize there's got to have been conversation between the painter and the person sitting there that kind of gets taken out. You just get the stare rather than the human interaction between painter and someone sitting for a painting. So my parting thought is that we can take Kant's categorical imperative or the golden rule in the New Testament and turn that around and say, stare unto others as you would have them stare unto you. So it's not like don't stare, because that's what parents tell children. That's impossible. You can't not stare. Like if I said to you in the next 5 minutes, don't think of a pink elephant, it'd be pretty hard to do that. So, you know, the answer is not don't stare. The answer is to stare in a way that you would want to be stared at. And that reciprocity, I think, is what we've basically been talking about. So I think there's plenty of time for questions and answers. And I think I can understand them in Polish if I do something with it.
Yes. Martyno, czy Lennard wie, jak tego użyć? Wie Lennard, jak tego użyć, bo nie jestem pewna, czy wie, jak tego użyć. Tam się na kanał, wiesz.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja będę zadawać po polsku, w języku polskim te pytania swoje. Dobrze. Już? Można? Nie. Już? Tak? Czy pan profesor uważa, że to określenie gapienie się jest tak naukowo uprawomocnionym? Pan profesor jest, rozumiem, profesorem uniwersyteckim. Czy tego terminu gapienie się używa w znaczeniu takim potocznym, czy też jako pojęcie właśnie naukowe? Dlaczego o to pytam? No wiemy, że zmysł wzroku jest naszym podstawowym takim zmysłem orientacyjnym i patrząc na innych, czy też obserwując innych, spostrzegając innych, zdobywamy informacje o nich, tak jak o innych elementach tego świata widzialnego. Stąd moja ostrożność właśnie, jeżeli chodzi o upowszechnienie tego takiego pojęcia na każdą naszą obserwację, każde nasze spostrzeganie, uogólnienia na to pojęcie gapienie, bo ono obejmuje moim zdaniem przynajmniej tylko właśnie takie bezmyślne troszeczkę i takie no, z prostych dosyć niekiedy emocji wynikające właśnie spostrzeganie drugiego człowieka, spostrzeganie jego emocji. My mówiliśmy o relacjach takich w procesie poznania, bo to zawsze jest relacja osób dorosłych, ale zauważmy, że również dzieci bardzo są zainteresowane odmiennością innych. Ja przypominam sobie z mojej sytuacji rodzinnej takie historie, kiedy właśnie dzieci bardzo wpatrywały się w twarz, w osobę, w zachowanie mojej siostry, które to zachowanie było inne, było różne i budziło ich właśnie ciekawość. To nie było, one w ten sposób poznawały tę odmienność. Ja nie reagowałam na to negatywnie, przeciwnie do mojej mamy, która była w takich sytuacjach, czuła się bardzo upokorzona. Ale zmierzam do tego, że właśnie no, kontakt wzrokowy jest podstawowym takim rodzajem kontaktu ludzkiego. W tej chwili pan profesor mówił, że na ulicach Nowego Jorku no, mijacie się, ja tam nigdy nie byłam, bez tego kontaktu wzrokowego. Myślę, że to jest jakaś no, cecha naszych czasów, ale ten kontakt wzrokowy jest najbardziej takim osobowym jednak kontaktem. On też wyposaża nas w pewne informacje. Jeżeli ja jadę z kimś w autobusie, dzielę z nim miejsce w autobusie czy w innym środku komunikacji, to obserwując tę osobę wiem, czy ona nie wyciągnie za chwilę noża z kieszeni i nie dźgnie mnie nim, czy też jest nastawiona do mnie właśnie pozytywnie. Czyli niejako ja muszę zdobyć tę informację o tej osobie, co mnie może czekać z jej strony również. Przyznam się, że nie jestem taka święta i niekiedy gapię się, rzeczywiście gapię się i to tak bezczelnie się gapię. Ale gapię się kiedy? Kiedy zachowanie ludzi mnie bardzo denerwuje. Kiedy mnie bardzo denerwuje i tak myślę, Boże, no ty młoda kobieto, ty młody mężczyzno, czy ty starsza kobieto, starszy mężczyzno, czy ty nie wiesz, że obowiązują pewne zasady i że twoje zachowanie no, przekracza te normy społecznego współżycia. I tak się patrzę, no gapię i myślę sobie, no, jak trzeba, jakim być, jaką trzeba mieć osobowość, prawda, co myśleć, żeby tak nie zważać na innych, żeby właśnie tak zachowywać się w sposób no, troszeczkę niezgodny z tymi normami. Może za dużo powiedziałam, więc to było to.
Gdybyśmy to mogli zamknąć w jednym pytaniu.
Tak?
Czy to jest kategoria naukowa?
A, no tak, właśnie. Czy to jest, tak, bo w zasadzie naukowa to byłaby percepcja, prawda? Spostrzeganie, percepcja. No dziękuję bardzo i przepraszam, no.
Okay. No, I think a lot of what you said is very valid. You know, there's many layers of the way people think about staring. So obviously there are scientists. It's part of that obsessive scientific behavior that I mentioned, who are doing kind of quantitative measurements of people. But I think, you know, for most of us, yes, if you have vision, we gather information through our eyes. Humans are information gathering animals. And we're trying to take in as much information as we possibly can through our eyes. But that's what I said, it's a kind of a balletic performance, it's like dance, where you can look and you can't look. And generally, in this kind of notion of civil interaction, we don't stare at each other. And by the way, people do look at each other in New York. I want to defend New York. It's just that there's a protocol that we've all learned about you can look at someone about 15 feet away until that point. Then you kind of look away, and as the person is passing, you can glance back. If you do something different than that, I think we've all had the experience of the Hitchcock tennis game where someone is staring at you in a public place. And that is very uncomfortable. It's aggressive. You know, sustained looking in someone's eyes is aggressive. So then you would be right to try to, I mean, one of the other things is people do stare to find out or to gather information about the other. Is the other dangerous or safe, which is what you were saying. Has anyone ever pulled a knife on you on the bus? I was like a little afraid about that. So yeah, it really is this issue about how do you regard the other? I mean, you know, there's a philosopher whose name is Levinas, and Levinas has this whole theory about how we acknowledge, and also Martin Buber, how we acknowledge each other's being through the eyes. So I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but it's a question of the nature of the interaction like anything else. I mean, you can talk to somebody, we do that all the time, but you can be very aggressive in talking, and that can be different. We're very sensitive creatures. We're very good at figuring out what's going on in the social interaction at the moment. So staring is just one part of that. I mean, we're constantly taking in all kinds of information, subliminal, and that we're aware of and that we're not aware of. Like, for example, one of the things that when you're trying to tell whether someone wants to be more close to you is there's body language that we know but we can't articulate. And there's also literally the size of your irises. When you're interested in someone, your irises get bigger. I mean, no one notices that. No one says like, oh, that person's irises are bigger. They must be interested in me. These are things that you know subliminally. So it's one part of a kind of, you know, it's almost like an etiquette. It's one part of an etiquette of the way when you grow up and you're socialized to some degree, you learn you can do this, you can't do that. But the point, I think, for me is what happens when the person is poor, what happens if they're disabled. If I have a camera and I just walk up to you the way that Dorothea Lange walked up to that woman, Florence Owens Thompson, you're not going to let me do that. You know, you're not going to let me do that. It's the power structure that shapes that encounter and then therefore the photograph.
Jestem zainteresowany, jeżeli chodzi o kwestie naukowych badań społecznych. Tutaj mówimy o tych dwóch grupach osób niepełnosprawnych i osób biednych. To która z tych dwóch grup która jest bardziej obserwowana, na którą się bardziej ludzie gapią, w cudzysłowie? Czy mówimy też, czy to właśnie osoby z niepełnosprawnością, czy może jednak osoby biedne, czy może jakieś, nie wiem, mniejszości narodowe?
I don't have a good answer for that. What I would say is that we tend to segregate the poor in a way more than we may do for people with disabilities. So I don't, for the average encounter of a middle-class person with a poor person, will they go into a poor neighborhood? In which case, it probably would be not a good idea to stare because the poor people would be in a group. If it's a single homeless person on the street who's begging, then there might be some staring. But I think with people with disabilities who move through the general population, I think there's more opportunity for non-disabled people to stare. I mean, like, for example, you're deaf, I gather. And when I see deaf people talking to each other, I'm immediately drawn to it because my parents were deaf. So I always want to see what they're talking about, what they're saying. But it's a different that's a different kind of staring from people who don't know sign language. I'm eavesdropping, basically. But you know, for people who don't know sign language, it's more like the stereotypes that I'm sure you've run into, like, look, those deaf people are so animated. Why, you know, they seem so happy, you know, they're always full of energy, you know. So, you know, often when you stare at someone who is disabled, you're just staring to confirm what you think you already know, which is probably wrong if on the part of people who are non-disabled. You know, if they really wanted to know about disabled people, they should come to performances like Theater 21. Staring doesn't tell you very much. It just confirms an exterior position.
Thanks, that was great. I really enjoyed that. I suppose my question is just about fear. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, you want microphone? Sorry. Thank you. I really enjoyed that, Lennard. My question was about fear and to what extent you think staring is a manifestation of fear.
I assume you mean that there's something that frightens non-disabled people. Is that what you mean about disabled people? Possibly. I mean, I think one of the things about disability that's interesting as a identity is that people with disabilities, let me put it this way, any person who's, you know, considers themselves an able-bodied person can become disabled in a minute. So there is a thing about disability which can be frightening because, you know, if I see a person of color, I know that I'm never gonna be a person of color. I'm not gonna wake up tomorrow morning and become a person of color. But I could wake up tomorrow morning and have a variety of disabilities. So I think there is an element of like cautionary observation, maybe more than fear. Or in the case of someone who's like very visibly like mutilated or maimed in some way, missing a limb, there can be that notion like, oh, if that happened to that person, that could happen to me. And therefore, something about like if I look long enough, I'll have some control over the situation. Or more realistically, I'll be able to say like, nah, that will never happen to me, as a reassurance. That person is other. That's why I can stare at them. So I think there is an element of that notion of fear in there.
Mam dwa pytania, dwa przemyślenia. Mam dwa przemyślenia na ten temat i akurat jestem zainteresowany ogólnie normami, normalnością, normalizacją. I wiemy, jak obserwacja może wpływać na to, szczególnie pod kątem, nie wiem, obcokrajowców czy też niepełnosprawności. To nie jest jednoznaczne, to nie jest takie samo dla wszystkich. To może zależeć od wychowania, od życia, od dostępu do technologii, od wielu innych rzeczy, które mogą wpływać na to, jak obserwujemy, jak się gapimy. A druga sprawa, to tak mi teraz przyszło do głowy, Przyszła mi do głowy artystka Martina Abramowicz, dziękuję, która właśnie wykorzystuje to obserwację, to patrzenie się tak długo w kogoś i co pan profesor o tym myśli? Co pan o tym myśli, jeżeli chodzi o właśnie element tej sztuki?
Yeah, I have seen Abramovich in person a number of times. There was a big show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but like one of her there's a very big room in the Museum of Modern Art, and she sits there before the museum opens and doesn't change her seat until the museum is closed. And people line up and sit opposite her, and they look at each other for, as long as you want. And it's amazing that she's unbelievable in the way, but her work is about that sense of vision, staring, contact with other bodies. In that particular show, there was a very complex thing, because if you entered the show to see her work, you had to walk between two naked people who were facing each other. And usually a man and a woman, and who are facing each other, and there's a space about this big that you have to walk by. And there's a lot of negotiation about staring, because they're naked. A lot of the people that she works with are naked in the exhibitions. So there's a whole question about, can you look at the naked body? Should you look at it? Should you not look at it? But then you also have to make this additional decision about which person you're going to face and which person you're going to not face. And and they're standing so close that their genitals, their breasts are like going to touch you. So this is a very complex decision. They did have another entrance for people who were afraid to do it. And a lot of people were afraid because it's that intimate. Do you look at the person as you're going by? Do you feel them? Which part of your body do you want to touch their body? So I think that the Abramovich's work is a brilliant idea, and if I'd thought about it, I would have put it up. Thank you for that. But the other thing I was just interested in also is that, deaf people have been called people of the eye. And, there's a Ben Bahan, who's an American deaf philosopher, and has come up with the idea of people of the eye. So there'd be an interesting question for me about deaf looking versus hearing looking, and whether that is a very different thing or not. I haven't thought about it that much. I wonder if you have. But because going back to your question, the information gathering is more sophisticated in a way, more intense on the part of deaf people than hearing people, I think.
Ja bym chciała się podzielić taką sytuacją, której doświadczyliśmy w Teatrze 21 podczas jednego ze spektakli. I tutaj to nawiązuje też do pytania Jonathana o strach, a ja bym chciała powiedzieć o drugiej stronie, o ryzyku. W momencie, kiedy ja się wystawiam świadomie jako aktor na gapienie, bo teatr jest dla mnie przestrzenią umożliwiającą gapienie. I jeden z naszych spektakli, Statek Miłości, zaczyna się taką sceną, gdzie 16 aktorów stoi w linii, ale ma maski różnych celebrytów na sobie. I stoją w tych maskach. I w momencie, kiedy nasi aktorzy, 16 osób, zdejmuje te maski i nagle stoi przed widownią 16 osób z zespołem Downa. I pamiętam, że jedna z naszych widzek wstała z pierwszego rzędu, podeszła do nas, my siedziałyśmy na schodach i powiedziała: muszę przesiąść się dalej, proszę mi wybaczyć, ale to jest za blisko, nie jestem na to gotowa. I ja to przyjęłam wtedy jako niezwykłą sytuację podjęcia pracy z obrazem i że też gapienie jest procesem. I jest procesem, który wymaga czasu i też wielu kolejnych powrotów do różnych obrazów, do oswajania się też z pewnymi obrazami, po to, żeby one też nas nie wystraszały na przykład. Ale tą sytuację też zauważyli nasi aktorzy. I mieliśmy długo o tym rozmowę właśnie, o tym, jak za każdym razem, wchodząc na scenę, podejmujesz to ryzyko i stajesz się, zgadzasz się na to, że się na ciebie ktoś gapi po prostu. Więc to jest też ta kwestia ryzyka bardzo dla mnie zawsze za każdym razem ciekawa i gdzieś łączy ona właśnie, to są te dwie strony strachu, ale z drugiej strony też ryzyka podejmowanego.
No, I think that's a beautiful example of the kind of thing we've been talking about. And I do think also, you know, for so many of you who are performers or work with performers, that taking on, I mean, there has to be part of you that enjoys that taking on that risk and having the attention drawn to you. I mean, I know as a professor, look, I mean, you know, when you ask people what is the thing that they most fear, it's public speaking. Yeah. So, but like for me, that's what I do for a living, and I obviously I don't mind it, and I don't consider being stared at in this situation a bad thing. So it's a question of what the social construction of the space is. If you're the performer, then you're in control in a way. I mean, you're subject to the audience's reaction, but you're in control. For those same people on the street or in a social interaction, it could be very different. Yeah.
My question is actually back, bro. My question is actually what happened actually between your eyeballs and your brain. I ask this because I'm nearly blind and I know and I not know what actually happened. I know something between them that sense that help seeing, but I don't the technical things about it.
I'm not clear about the question. Could you state that question again?
The question, what happened between your the eyes and your brain?
You mean the biology, the biological?
Yes.
So that's not necessarily my field of expertise, but I would say that I would have a kind of, I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know that I'm the best person to explain the physiology of that, but I think one thing that is interesting is I have many blind colleagues and friends, and you know, the people who are around them often don't know what to do. And often will like try to avoid words like, oh, I saw someone, or, you know, did you see that? And whereas most of the blind people I know don't avoid those words at all. So, you know, I saw someone yesterday, we had a good time. So I think there is the physiology that you're talking about that someone could explain better than I can, but there's also the social context of interaction with people with disabilities. In some cases it might involve staring, in other cases it might involve a certain discomfort that has to do with, you know, I can see and you can't, and I don't know how to behave around you.
Ja mam pytanie. Ja mam takie spostrzeżenie, jestem osobą z niepełnosprawnością, na co dzień doświadczam gapienia się i mam pytanie związane z tym, że jak to jest, i to też nawiążę do tego, co mówiła Justyna, bo też jestem performerką i widzę, jak osoby chętnie przychodzą na występy i jak też z nich wychodzą, bo nie są gotowe patrzeć się, gapić się, kiedy mogą, kiedy podejmują decyzję, że mogą się gapić w tej sytuacji. Jak to jest, że łatwiej, takie moje spostrzeżenie, łatwiej jest gapić się ludziom na ulicy, niż przyjść na przedstawienie, na performance, gdzie to gapienie jest jakby dozwolone, gdzie osoby z alternatywną motoryką, sensoryką są wystawione na scenie i to gapienie jest właśnie free, za darmo.
That's a really good observation. You could probably answer that question better than I could, but I think that one thing is the staring on the street seems to be on their part furtive, that is to say, kind of hidden. We've all developed a way of looking with thinking that we're not being detected. Whereas when you've paid your money and you've gone to the performance, you don't have the comfort of thinking that you're hidden. You're exposed in a weird way. The actor is exposed, but the person is exposed. They've paid their money. They've come to see it. When you were talking about that, I was thinking about Matt Fraser, who is an actor. I don't know if you know him. And he, I think he was a thalidomide baby. So he has short arms or no arms. He, of all the actors that I know, he loves being naked. You know Matt, right? So I went to see a performance of Sleeping Beauty. Was it Sleeping Beauty? Yeah, that he does, not Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast. And part of that performance is that he gets on stage, he takes his clothes off, and he gets in a bathtub and washes himself. It's a very uncomfortable thing. And part of that is because you sort of like have paid the money to go, and he's saying, watch me in really great detail. You can see everything about my body. You can look at my penis. You can look at my ass. You can do whatever you want. And that permission, in a way, is worse than if you're like a peeping Tom, or you're looking at porno and no one's watching you or something. So, I think it is that thing of like you're openly exposed as an audience,
Polish, jest. Z jednej strony ludzie się na mnie gapią i tutaj takie nawiązanie do pytania pana. Widzę czasem strach w oczach, ale z drugiej strony ludzie często odwracają wzrok i to też mi się nie podoba. Spotkałam się z takim sformułowaniem uprzejma nieuwaga. I co pan o tym myśli? Czy to jest jakiś krok dalej, czy to jest to samo, co gapienie się? Jak to traktować?
Can I ask you a question? Can you give her the microphone back? What way do you like to be looked at?
Nie umiem tego opisać, ale to się czuje, kiedy ktoś patrzy normalnie. Bo też ludzie się na mnie patrzą tak normalnie i wtedy czuję, tak, że to jest takie spojrzenie neutralne, bez oceny.
I think that's the thing that you're saying that's the most important is at the end, without assessment or evaluation. In other words, when we look at each other, we're looking at each other to gather information mutually. It's that thing that I put at the end about stare unto others as you would have them stare unto you. I mean, if there's an imbalance, I think what you're saying, and the imbalance can be staring too much or can be looking away. Both of those are a kind of imbalance. Normally, when you're talking to someone, you don't look away. If you do, someone will say, like, why aren't you paying attention? Or if they look at you too much, then you can feel uncomfortable as well. Another question while you're about to ask that is just the thinking about it. Like, most of us want to be observed. We don't want to be ignored. We'd like to be looked at and have people think that we look good or we dressed well, or we want to have compliments. We don't want the negative thing. So there is it isn't like we don't want to be looked at, but there's, what I've been saying is a kind of ineffable balance. It's very hard to figure out what that is, and only each person can determine what that's going to be. Sorry.
You talked told something about controlling the space as a performer when you are being observed and observing. And this remind me an artist conference that I saw very recently. It's Jess Tom. I don't know if you know she work about her artist's name is Tourette Hero, and the conversation was about this idea of staring and being on stage and feeling safe, and being on the audience and not feeling safe as an audience member because having Tourette. And on the stage was talking and performing, and it was a safe place. So this all conversation reminds me a lot about this safe area and not safe area. So how can you be safe on stage as a performer and not being safe as an audience member? And this is very tricky and intrigued me a lot.
I don't know which device to use. No, that's absolutely right. But it also, let's think that people do come to theaters and to movies to become uncomfortable. I mean, the horror movie is the good example of that. It's a controlled space and it's safe generally, but you can feel unsafe for the moment. So it's a question of you know, momentary safeness within a confined, but wanting to have an uncomfortable feeling, right? I was just thinking, you know, since you're all kind of performers, could I ask you to do something for a second? Which is, and now you're going to feel unsafe. Is turn to the person next to you and stare in their eyes for, let's say, 20 seconds. I'll count. Okay? You want to do it? Okay, start. Okay, that's 20. Did that feel like a really long time? Yeah. So I wonder what happened. I noticed a lot of you were smiling. That's a way to diffuse something. It's an uncomfortable thing, right? I mean, normally we don't do that. So maybe I'll go off stage with that as the experiential ending to the talk.
Well, I don't have a question, but I do want to say thank you for this very, very interesting information, the images, your story. We are a group from Rotterdam, Theater Babel Rotterdam, but we do have to leave, and we don't want to interrupt the rest if you want to stay and talk more, but we do have to leave the room, so thank you so much. We have to go, but thank you.
I have one quick question, actually. But if you stare too long, has that any effect on your eyes of the extreme consequences, actually? Or,
You know, again, I'm not a doctor, but I'll tell you, my mother always felt like when I was growing up, don't watch TV for too long because you'll get eye strain. Eye strain doesn't really exist as far as I know, but it's like the same thing about don't swim after you eat because you'll seize up. No one has ever drowned because of that. But, you know, I mean, so I don't think so. I think you can stare, and I don't know that there are health consequences.
okay, thank you.
Ja tylko chciałam zapytać jeszcze, czy ma pan jakiś sposób na odróżnienie... Oj, dobrze, dziękuję, przepraszam. Czy posiada pan profesor jakiś test, jakiś sposób na odróżnienie prawdziwego ubogiego od ubogiego, którego ubóstwo stało się stylem życia, który po prostu no tak wyuczył się tego syndromu wyuczonej bezradności, prawda? I w zasadzie nie jest to prawdziwie, jeżeli tak można powiedzieć, człowiek ubogi, tylko nie jest to ubóstwo takie, no nie chcę używać tego określenia prawdziwe, ale troszeczkę ubóstwo, dzięki któremu się coś tam dla siebie załatwia, coś wygrywa, odpycha pracę, odpycha pracę. No bo ja rozumiem, że niepełnosprawność i ubóstwo to są takie kategorie, które po ich stwierdzeniu wymagają od współziomków pewnej pomocy, pewnego zaangażowania, prawda? Więc w przypadku osób niepełnosprawnych w taki sposób, jaki dana osoba tego wymaga, a w przypadku ubogich osób, no pomocy wręcz właśnie jakiejś materialnej czy innej tego typu, prawda? By nie tylko się gapić na to ubóstwo, ale by jemu jakoś przeciwdziałać. Czy łatwo jest, czy pan profesor ma jakiś sposób na odróżnienie faktycznego od udawanego ubóstwa? O, tak to nazwijmy może, prostacko. Dziękuję.
That would be like a completely other talk. I'm giving a talk about that, but not here. I would just say that, you know, the idea of the faker, the poor person who's the faker, there's a long history to that. The vast majority of people who are poor are not faking it. So I don't worry about the very small number of people who might be faking poverty. I think what we have to deal with is the vast number of people who really are poor and need assistance.
Okej, to już proszę Państwa ostatnie pytanie, bo czas nam się kończy.
Ja chciałam zapytać, ponieważ w mojej opinii jest jeszcze jedna sytuacja, w której możemy się bezkarnie gapić i wykorzystujemy ją. Znam osoby, które ją wykorzystują. Jest to pójście do muzeum i gapienie się na portrety. Dla mnie to jest już gapienie się. Chciałam zapytać, gdzie jest ta granica i czy to też jest gapienie się, kiedy patrzymy na to w ten sposób, tymi kategoriami? Czy to jest jeszcze patrzenie, czy to jest już gapienie się na portrety, na portretowane osoby?
That's a good question. I think that's a place we have complete permission to look as long as we want. And it may be one of the reasons that people have portraits painted because they wanted their own images to be preserved. But I think the other thing, like why we have national portrait galleries and all of that, is because the rules are off. We can comfortably stare at, you know, a pope from 300 years ago and not worry that he's going to look back at us and there are no consequences. He's not going to excommunicate us or whatever. So I do think that that's part of the pleasure of being able to like sustainedly look at someone's face. Because, you know, as I said, the earliest experiences that we have as babies is we're staring at our mother's face. We can do that for hours. We have done that, hours. It must be a great pleasure to just stare, you know, suck on a breast and stare at a face. I mean, your job as a child is very simple. And, you know, so that pleasure that we have as infants, for a good year or 2 years, can then translate itself. We can't do that with each other. We can't do that you can do that on the sly, or you can do that with someone you're in love with. You gaze at the person you're in love with for hours and they love it and you love it. But for most people, you can't do that. But you go to the museums and you can. So I think that there is a kind of erotic pleasure. I don't mean erotic, but a kind of sensuous pleasure of being able to stare at someone's face without being interrupted except by someone getting in front of you in the museum, you know.
Bardzo dziękuję.